Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well and are safe. So, in this lecture, I'm going to tell you about Heart of Darkness. I hope you have read the novel and I hope you have enjoyed it. Um, Heart of Darkness, apart leaving the literary considerations and leaving the critical considerations aside, is a very beautifully written novel, and I hope you liked its narration, the way it describes human character, the way it describes the Congo itself. The mystique it develops from the very beginning of the novel is very, I would say, intense and very beautiful. So, to begin, Heart of Darkness discusses the situation in Congo, and if you remember, we discussed King Leopold, we discussed what the colonized Congo looked like, what King Leopold and his people had been doing for rubber and for ivory in that region. The Congolese people, the people who were colonized, were treated really brutally by the Belgian conquerors. Now, um, Conrad himself went to the Congo and he firsthand saw what was happening. Being a Western person, he was originally a Russian. He later on changed and became part of the British Empire. And so many people say that Conrad was, he didn't agree with colonization. He saw it in its worst, he saw the worst phase of colonization in Congo. But he thought that that kind of colonization was restricted maybe to the Belgian colonization or the French. He did not think that that was how the British colonies worked. Although the British cruelty in their colonies is definitely something that has been addressed by post-colonial authors for a long time now. So Conrad's bias does come out a little bit in Heart of Darkness, which begins with five people sitting in a boat on the Thames, and while they're talking about it, Marlowe says that this too has been one of the dark places of the earth. And when he uses the term dark, he is specifically talking about the darkness that is present within humanity, not just in terms of, you know, just a lack of civilization, but also how are civilized nations of the world different from what is considered civilizations which are not civilized in a way. And that is the idea that we have basic human morals. We follow laws. We follow a certain moral code, and so he talks about, when he thinks about it, it's making a reference to what Britain would have looked like to the Roman conquerors, because Britain too was at that time, it was there were small kingdoms, and those people had a very tribal way of life, basically the same kind of life that the African people in Congo had, and the Romans conquered it. But he's also making a reference to the fact that that darkness, in his opinion, in Conrad's opinion, and his narrator Marlowe's opinion, exists within all of us. And this is the facade of the civilization that sort of suppresses the darkness from coming out. And his narrative, as it unfolds, it tells you that that darkness, when unrestrained, when given free rein without any laws, any policemen, anything around, can actually set out to harm people, set out to harm the way or everything that human beings have built, which touches a very modernist concern, that is there a basic humanity, is there a basic truth, a basic human goodness, anything that we can fall back on. The idea taken from religion had already, for most people, a lot of people, been, science had already kind of put it in doubt, And so there was nothing really very strong to fall back on. And the idea that human beings have a moral mission to go and civilize these masses and these people seemed to be something that is imbued with the idea of truth. But as Marlowe starts his narration in Heart of Darkness, you see that that is not what is happening. And the first thing that becomes apparent and that becomes very clear is that the Western people within the Congo region, are the people who are shown to be the most depraved of all. Now, if you notice the people like the brickmaker, the manager in the central station, who wears all white, um, they all of them seem to be hungry for power, seem to be hungry for riches, but they seem to lack basic empathy and basic morality. So, one of the themes that I would like to discuss, first of all, which Marlowe uses a lot in symbolism, is something called binary oppositions. And when we use the term binary oppositions, we mean when we make a difference between night and day, a light and dark, good and evil. So basically, we are saying that there are these two things and there is nothing in between. Marlowe uses the term darkness a lot to designate the darkness present within the human soul. But he also constantly references Africa as dark, not just because of the skin color of the African people there, of the people in the Congo, but also because of the jungle, because of the forest all around. And he seems to present it with a lot of mystique. He uses a lot of metaphors, he uses a lot of language to focus on that, but at the same time to show how hollow and how empty the Western concept of whiteness is. He dresses the people he seems to show as, he uses a term for the brickmaker, I think. He calls him a paper mache Mephistopheles, which Mephistopheles, refers to to a devil in Paradise Lost, a devil. And paper mache means something, the art that is empty from within. So whenever he references these people, and like the manager at the central station, they are empty from within. He wears this whole immaculate white dress, all immaculate. But is there anything behind that? No, there is not. So if you notice, you will see throughout the novel that there are oppositions. Like, he presents the Thames as the civilized river, the river that from people set out on expeditions from to civilize the rest of the world. But can they do that actually when they go there and they themselves turn into these monsters of depravity where they harm people, and they have a lust of power and money? So Thames is constantly compared to the Congo. And so Congo is also the idea of primitivism, which is very severely criticized by post-colonialism, because it creates a trajectory as if the Western civilization is on the way to development and it has reached a pinnacle of development, while other civilizations are catching up and they are in previous stages of development, which so many scientific discoveries, anthropological studies have shown to be completely untrue, because these nations were not allowed to develop on their own. They were not allowed the freedom and the independence to decide for themselves. They would probably have developed in their own ways, developed their own scientific methods, which were never, which couldn't happen because they were exploited for the material resources they have and the labor that they could provide. So calling them primitive just because you don't understand their culture is an extremely racist ideology, which you will notice is prevalent throughout this novella. And the concept of Heart of Darkness, where again focusing on binary oppositions of the civilized and the savages, the two terms that are being used, civilized, savage, the Thames, and then the Congo, darkness and light, the clothes of the people, which are very white, but inside they're completely empty. All of these things, the symbolism that Conrad generates, focuses on the concept of binary oppositions. But a post-structuralist idea is that binary oppositions create an unequal relationship where light as compared to dark is always given preference, and darkness is considered inferior. And at the same time, when both of these things are put together, lightness seems to get its good qualities or get its position of prestige by subduing or by minimizing or by sort of like setting itself in relief with darkness. So this kind of thing also does not take into consideration the idea that there are gray areas in between. There is never a complete black and white. There are so many things that are never considered. So Marlowe's novel draws this out in Conrad's novel draws this out in sharp relief. So this is the first theme that I would like you to keep in mind while answering the questions in the discussion, because I'm assuming you have already read the novel. I gave you guys a week so that you could focus on the previous discussions and not feel rushed. And then the second idea is the second theme is an ambivalent criticism of colonialism. Now, Conrad definitely criticizes colonialism, definitely criticizes imperialism, but there's an ambivalence, because he seems to at the same time think that the Western civilization is a big deal, and he seems to not think that colonization is evil and dangerous to the people that are being colonized, whose lives are destroyed, who are used not as human beings at all, but they have been completely dehumanized. Now, if you notice, they have been completely dehumanized. So why only focus on just what the impact of colonization is doing to the colonizers themselves? So people have said that there has been a lot of ambivalence, and as you will see in the next two critical readings, some post-colonial critics and poets directly attack Conrad for being racist and derogatory to their cultures. So definitely there is an ambivalence. I'm sure you will find lots of passages, and I would like to see what you come up with when you start the discussion on ambivalence when Conrad criticizes colonialism or colonial practices. And then we have dehumanization and death. That is a very, very prevalent theme within Heart of Darkness. Now, if you notice, the Africans are never really given a voice in Heart of Darkness. They are not allowed to speak. Their speech is considered as grunts and noises and things which are primitive and which recall the darkness and recall the word that Conrad uses, kinship, to mind. And that becomes a problem, because I think it's only at the very end that there is the Congolese servant of the central manager who announces Kurt's death, and announces it by saying that Mr. Kurtz, he dead. That is the only time that he's allowed to speak, and the other sailors, when their attack is going on at the end, and they request or they say that let us get to them so that we can eat them, the cannibalization. So the only times they're allowed to speak is to sort of enhance the fact that they are different from us, that they eat their own counterparts, that they are cannibals. But the idea that critics find nowadays in the work is that this dehumanization of the Africans actually shows the dehumanization of the colonizers themselves as well, because you're not giving them voice, you're not giving them the chance to speak for themselves, you're criticizing them for problems within their own culture. But at the same time, what are you doing? Aren't you killing them? Aren't you harming them, murdering brutally the women and the children, forcing them to work for you? Are you any better in that regard? And if you think you are, why do you think you are? So that becomes a big issue, that becomes a big problem, and the amount of death and destruction that is present in Heart of Darkness, you can see for yourself, like the bodies, the poor people who, when they got too ill to work, would crawl away to die. Just imagine the pain and the misery that is depicted in Heart of Darkness in that way. And then we move on to the next theme, which is religion, religious imagery. If you notice, he calls a lot of the people who walk around because they carry sticks pilgrims. And that is very ironic, because Conrad thought that the whole idea of religion being brought to these people, Christianity being brought to these people, was really inherently flawed, because these people came in the guise of like, oh, we're saviors, we're going to bring Christianity to them and save them. But are they really being saved? What is happening to these people? They are murdered, they are brutalized, they are forced to work like animals. Their humanity is not given any consideration, and simultaneously they are being told that they should come to this religion that is supposed to teach equality and peace. So Conrad's religious imagery is very strong throughout, and I would like you to go and explore it and tell me what you think about it. It is an incredibly, despite the problems within that we see from a modern lens, Heart of Darkness used to be, and is still in a part, one of my favorite novels, because there is no doubt about Conrad's writing style, that it is stunningly beautiful, and the narration very modern, very, very internally, he looks internally towards his own self, towards the human constitution a lot, and the metaphors, the imagery, it's stunning altogether. So despite the problems that we see within the novel, I would like you to comment on that as well, to comment on what you thought of the narration, to comment on what you thought of Marlowe as a character maybe. Okay, so from religious imagery, we move to the next theme, which is materialism, power, greed. You remember Mark Twain's soliloquy? Remember when he wrote Leopold's soliloquy? One thing was the cruelty that was being done to the native population, and another thing was why it was being done. The reason behind it was definitely material greed. There was rubber, there was labor, and then there was ivory there. Three things that actually led to all this bloodshed, this brutality that was unbelievable in that area. And that brutality is exemplified by the fact of how Kurds handled this. These people who were not very educated at the time, who did not know how to defend themselves, thought that the way Kurtz handled stuff, he made himself a god in the novella to these people. And he carried out raids, he stole the ivory, he murdered and butchered people, and he had their heads put on stakes around the place where he lived, which Marlowe witnesses and tells about in the story. And this is not an isolated incident, because these things were things that Conrad actually saw on his journey. So these things are actually happening. They are not just fictionalized for the sake of Heart of Darkness. They were really, really happening at the time. So the factor that led to these kind of things was materialism. The idea that capitalism was coming out at this time, the fact that we need to make a lot of money, the market needs to be free, there needs to be free trade. But the free trade, on the name of free trade, what was happening was that all over the world, people thought that there was trading going on in the Congo, but there was no trade. It was slave labor. Only ammunition would go from the west to the Congo, and on the return, a lot of ivory, a lot of rubber would go back, and these people were slaves. They worked for nothing, and it's just not that they worked for nothing. They were murdered and butchered in ways that were unbelievable. So power, greed, and materialism are things that are constantly reflected in the novel. Think about the power politics between the brickmaker, a person who is named the brickmaker and called the brickmaker because of his profession, but he never made any bricks. So the laziness, the concept, the Western colonies were extremely lazy and they never did their work and were just power hungry was definitely there. And then the Sanho manager's uncle, the party who comes there and is looking for now the name is I'm forgetting the name, but if you remember Candide, the beautiful mythical place El Dorado. So they're looking for El Dorado, which again recalls the fact that they are looking for riches. They're looking for the promised land made of gold. And that is what prompts the rest of them too. They don't like Coates because he provides a lot of ivory. He is idolized in the company, and that harms the position of the central manager who wants to be the top guy there. So power, greed, materialism are the stories imbued with them throughout. And then definitely racism, another theme that is prevalent in the novel. One of the biggest indicators of racism is the fact that the African people are not given a voice, except for the fact when their savage natures are highlighted, like we want to eat other people, or this person is dead, or maliciousness is shown. But can people, a whole civilization, just be malicious? So the idea that Conrad saw these people, or Marlowe, his narrator, saw these people as not as just human beings, but as some people, as individuals who are dehumanized, who have nothing within them, is very, very problematic. And then another, the fact that a Western civilized man struggles within himself for morality and civilization and loses to the darkness that is present in Africa is also a very, very problematic concept. Because does that mean that Africa influences that person, or does it mean that that person himself is hollow from within? So the racism present in the novel is extreme to a level that it has been subject to a lot of criticism. Then Heart of Darkness, the fourth theme is colonialism. And remember, Heart of Darkness is considered part of modern literature, but also part of colonial literature, the kind of literature that was being produced about the colonies in the colonizing nations. So it is a critique of colonialism. Definitely, Conrad at no point glorifies the idea of what the colonizers are doing. But at the same time, he still kind of glorifies colonialism itself. Remember in the beginning where they're all sitting together and they're saying that this is the place, Thames, the river, where people set out from for adventure and exploit. So that is a kind of glorification, which is very problematic. So this is why we say that throughout the text, the narration is very, very ambivalent as far as the whole idea of colonialism goes. But you will still find critiques of colonialism, like the way the people were treated. So combining the theme of colonialism with racism, you will also notice that the people, the Africans, there were many times that Marlowe says that he prefers Africans because they're working, that they're hardworking, so constantly work is being valorized there, all right, which is a very capitalistic idea. And simultaneously, they're considered naive or dumb. And that is a big problem, because just because they are part of the colonized peoples, does that mean that they are naive and they don't really have faculties of their own? So that becomes a big issue, the issue of racism within colonization. And lastly, the theme of hollowness of civilization, that we have made this huge civilization, specifically the West, the European civilization in this regard, but which is hollow from within, because as soon as the vestiges of morality and civilization are taken away and you're put in a situation where you don't have law and you don't have policemen, suddenly do we lose our sense of goodness, our sense of right and wrong? Because remember, the central manager decides that the Russian trader who is there, who is damaging their, profits or something, his uncle suggested you could hang him because there is no law here, nobody will question you. So just think about it, that the idea that if you have nobody looking, you can do a bad thing. Does that make us think about ourselves? Would we do a bad thing if we thought we would never get caught? So is it just the law that is keeping human beings civilized? And if that is so, what does it say of basic human goodness, which was one of the basic questions of modernism at the time? So the hollowness of civilizations this was not just restricted to Conrad. The poem Hollow Man talks about it. Also, if any of you have read the novel Lord of Flies, where the airplane crashes and all these children are left alone on that island, and suddenly they develop these brutal instincts that would never be part of, kids like that. But that also shows that this kind of novel was being talked about a lot, this idea that civilization is just a facade, it's just a false notion that we have become progressive. But if just because we are left outside of civilization, we become less progressive and we become less human, what does that say of civilization? So I'm going to end my brief lecture here. I hope you enjoyed the novel, and if you have any questions, you can let me know about them. And look at a few important quotes of that I'm going to read out actually for you. One of the things, because that is something that I would like you to focus on when he talks about the laziness, the fact that inefficiency of the empire, that is an important theme. So there's a part in the novel where he says, "The flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of a rapacious and pitiless folly." Now this particular statement that he makes, he keeps on referencing back to it whenever inefficiency is shown in the empire. So inefficiency in the administration of the colonizers. So he says this is one of the central images, this is one of the central images that he uses, and he keeps referring back to it because this is something that Marlowe finds an objection to. So keep that in mind too. Why does he valorize work, and why does he valorize naivety? While that definitely means he's critiquing the colonizers, but what does that say about other concerns? Just because we are outside of civilization and humanity, all of these, this beak-eyed devil of rapacious and pitiless folly seems to come out of people, and they became not only cruel, they also become inefficient. So that becomes one of the prevalent themes of the novel that I would like you to think about. Think also of the flashbacks in the novel when he suddenly comes to himself back on the boat and Thames, when Marlowe does that, and reflects on what were the reasons and what were the causes. Also, I'm sorry, before finishing the lecture, I would like to say a few words about Kurtz. Now, Kurtz is a character in the novel who becomes a very, very important figure for Marlowe, because everybody seems to appreciate Kurtz, and so Marlowe thinks that Kurtz is the embodiment of what the Western civilization should be like. But what happens next is that doesn't remain true, because Kurtz seems to have gone through the worst degradation possible. He was so everything that Marlowe was focusing on, was trying to hope for, is completely destroyed within Kurtz. All right, so please focus on that a lot. Think about what Kurtz is doing. Why does he want to stay there? Why is he and the last words that he speaks, the horror. So Kurtz realizes that what he was doing was horrific. What he had done was horrific. Yet at the same time, his moral degradation was at such a level, and Conrad unfortunately blames the Congo for it, the darkness within the Congo that he keeps referencing, and that he realizes all of that, but he still does it. He still carries out those things, so that becomes a big issue. Take a minute, look at the of the novel, go over it, and hopefully you will have an interesting discussion. I'll see you in the next lecture.